She was 44 years old. The night before, she had been out with the man she loved, a Boston police officer, a father, a man she had built part of her life around. They spent the evening drinking with friends. At some point, she dropped him off at a house party. Then she drove away and went home. By morning, he was dead. His body was found in the snow. And almost immediately, suspicion turned to Karen Red. Investigators claimed she had backed her SUV into him and left him there during a blizzard to die. Karen Red said that wasn't true. She said John O'Keefe went into that house. She said something happened inside. And she said the people investigating his death never wanted the truth to come out. What followed was not just a murder case. It became one of the most controversial criminal cases in recent American history. A case that split a community, triggered outrage across the country, and forced people to ask a deeply unsettling question. Can a justice system truly investigate itself when one of its own is dead? This is the story of Karen Reed, a case involving a dead police officer, a woman accused of killing him, 2 trials, a mistrial, claims of planted evidence, missing footage, and a truth that still feels just out of reach. And at the center of it all is one question. What really happened to John O'Keefe on the night of January 28, 2022? Act 1. Who was Karen Red? Before getting into the evidence, the vehicle damage, the phone data, the taillight fragments, the injuries, the surveillance footage, you need to understand the people at the center of this story. Because over time, cases like this turn real lives into headlines. Karen Reed became the defendant, a face on television, a name in court documents. But before any of that, she was a person with a life, a career, and a future that, at least from the outside, appeared stable. Karen Red grew up in Massachusetts and built a professional career as a financial analyst. She was educated, accomplished, and by most accounts lived a relatively ordinary life. She was not deeply rooted in law enforcement culture. She was not part of that inner circle. And later, that detail would matter more than anyone expected. By early 2022, she had been in a relationship with Boston police officer John O'Keefe for around 2 years. John was 46 years old. He had spent over a decade with the Boston Police Department. But the part of his life many people focused on most had nothing to do with his badge. After a family tragedy, he had taken responsibility for raising his niece and nephew. He was seen as dependable, steady, and deeply committed to the people in his life. Karen and John's relationship, like many adult relationships, was not perfect. There were tensions. There were arguments. There were difficult moments. But there were also plans, routines, and the appearance of a shared life. Then came the night of January 28, 2022. A night that began like so many others, and ended with John O'Keefe dead in the snow. Act 2. The night. The evening started in Canton, Massachusetts. Karen and John first went to C.F. McCarthy's, a local bar where they met up with others. Surveillance footage captured parts of that night. People arriving, drinking, talking, moving in and out. At least from what could be seen on camera, nothing appeared extraordinary. Later, the group moved to another location, the Waterfall Bar and Grill. More drinks, more people, more footage. And later still, plans were made for an after-party at 34 Fairview Road, the home of another Boston police officer. That address would become the center of everything, because from this point on, the story divides into 2 completely different versions of reality. According to prosecutors, Karen dropped John off outside the house. An argument had escalated. In anger, or intoxication, she reversed her Lexus SUV into him, struck him, and drove away, leaving him outside in freezing conditions during a snowstorm. According to the defense, that never happened. They argued John entered the house. They suggested something violent took place inside or around that property. An altercation, an assault, something the official investigation either ignored or refused to fully examine. And according to that theory, John's body was later placed outside, while Karen Red became the convenient explanation. Those are the two competing narratives, and for years neither side has been able to erase the other. What is not disputed is what happened hours later. In the early morning of January 29th, Karen Red became alarmed when John never came home. She began looking for him. Eventually, she returned to Fairview Road. There, John O'Keefe was found unresponsive in the snow. The first responding officer's dash cam captured part of that chaotic scene. Karen is seen panicked, moving frantically, trying to understand what had happened. She appears distraught, disoriented, desperate. To some, that footage shows genuine shock. To others, it shows guilt crashing into reality. And that divide, what people think they see when they watch Karen Reed, would become one of the defining features of the entire case. Act 3. The investigation and the arrest. Once John O'Keefe's body was discovered, the investigation moved fast. To some observers, too fast. Because rather than fully opening outward, toward the house, the people inside it, and the broader circumstances of the night, the investigation quickly narrowed in on Karen Red. Her vehicle, a black Lexus SUV, became central to the prosecution's case. Investigators recovered broken taillight fragments near the scene. Prosecutors argued those pieces came from Karen's vehicle and proved that she struck John with enough force to shatter part of the taillight before driving away. That became one of the core pillars of the state's theory. But the defense attacked it aggressively. They argued some taillight fragments were not found immediately but appeared later after the initial search. They questioned how evidence of such importance could emerge in stages. They brought in experts who said the damage pattern on the vehicle did not match what they would expect from a high-impact pedestrian strike. And from there, the defense pushed one of the most explosive claims in the entire case, that the evidence may have been manipulated. Then there were John's injuries. Prosecutors argued the injuries were consistent with being hit by a vehicle and left in the cold. Defense experts said something different. They pointed to wounds they believed were inconsistent with a car strike and argued some injuries looked more like the result of an animal attack. The house at 34 Fairview Road had a dog, and the defense claimed there was evidence suggesting possible canine involvement. The prosecution rejected those conclusions. By this point, the case had become more than a straightforward homicide investigation. It had become a war between two entirely incompatible interpretations of the same evidence. Karen Reed was eventually charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter, and leaving the scene of a collision causing death. She pleaded not guilty, and from that moment on, the case stopped being local. It became national. Act 4. The First Trial. When the first trial began, public interest exploded. What might once have been a regional criminal case turned into a courtroom obsession. Testimony was live-streamed. Clips spread across social media. Legal commentators, true crime audiences, and ordinary viewers began dissecting every witness, every contradiction, and every frame of video evidence. And as the trial unfolded, the focus increasingly shifted. Not just toward what happened to John O'Keefe, but toward how the investigation itself had been conducted. That shift was critical, because the defense did not simply argue that Karen Red was innocent. They argued the entire investigation had been compromised from the beginning. They pointed to missing ring camera footage from John O'Keefe's home, footage that might have helped reconstruct the final hours before his death. The absence of that footage became a major point of suspicion. They also raised questions about surveillance footage involving Karen's vehicle while it was in police custody. One of the most controversial claims centered on footage that appeared to be mirrored or flipped. The defense suggested this was not a harmless technical issue, but part of a broader effort to obscure what really happened while the vehicle was under police control. Then there were the witness relationships. People connected to the house, to law enforcement, and to the victim were tied together through personal and professional networks. To the defense, that wasn't incidental. It was the heart of the problem. They argued the case had been handled inside a closed circle, one where loyalty and institutional protection could distort the search for truth. The prosecution dismissed those suggestions as speculation and conspiracy. But the damage had been done. The public was no longer only asking whether Karen Red hit John O'Keefe with her vehicle. They were asking whether investigators had ever seriously considered any other possibility. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. And then came the result. No verdict. The jury could not unanimously decide. The trial ended in a mistrial, which meant the questions remained alive, and the case was far from over. Act 5. The Retrial. And a city divided. By the time the retrial began, this case had grown into something much larger than a single prosecution. It had become symbolic. For some, Karen Red represented a woman being targeted because she was the easiest person to blame. For others, she was still the obvious suspect in the death of the man she had been with that night. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered in large numbers. They held signs, wore matching shirts, and turned the case into a public movement. Many believed they were watching a cover-up unfold in plain sight. They believed John O'Keefe entered that house alive, and that what happened afterward had been buried under layers of institutional protection. At the same time, there were many who saw those claims as a distraction. They looked at the broken taillight, the relationship tensions, the timeline, and Karen Reed's own statements and behavior, and concluded that the simplest explanation remained the correct one. That was the power of this case. The same evidence led different people to completely opposite conclusions. In the retrial, many of the same disputed elements returned to the center of the courtroom: the taillight fragments, the injury analysis, the phone data, the missing footage, the witness credibility, the possibility of bias, the possibility of contamination, the possibility that the truth had been distorted before the case ever reached a jury. And even after all that testimony, the case still resisted clean resolution, because beneath every legal argument was a deeper problem. Too many people no longer trusted the process itself, and once that trust collapses, every piece of evidence begins to look unstable. Act 6. What this case really became. The Karen Red case started as a death investigation. A man was found in the snow. A woman was accused. A prosecution followed. But that is not why this case became unforgettable. It became unforgettable because it forced people to confront something larger than one defendant and one victim. It raised questions about how investigations work when the victim is a police officer. It raised questions about what happens when law enforcement is asked to investigate a case involving its own networks, friendships, and loyalties. It raised questions about transparency, credibility, and whether public trust can survive when crucial evidence appears missing, delayed, disputed, or possibly mishandled. Cases like this expose a hard truth. Sometimes the trial is not just about what happened. Sometimes the trial is also about whether the public believes the truth was ever allowed to surface in the first place. That is what made this case different. Not just the death, not just the accusation, but the sense that beneath the official version of events, there may be another story entirely. One the system was never willing to confront honestly. Whether that suspicion is justified is still, for many people, the unresolved question. But the suspicion itself has changed everything. John O'Keefe was 46 years old. He was a police officer. He was a guardian to 2 children who had already suffered unimaginable loss. And no matter what anyone believes about Karen Reed, he deserved a death investigation that inspired confidence instead of doubt. Karen Reed has said she is innocent. Prosecutors have said she killed him. And years later, the public remains deeply divided, not only over who is telling the truth, but over whether the truth was ever protected at all. That is why this case continues to grip people, because it is not only about guilt or innocence. It is about power, loyalty, narrative, institutional trust, and what happens when the official story no longer feels complete. The footage is out there. The testimony is out there. The arguments are out there. And this is one of those cases that demands something rare from the public. Attention. Real attention. Because easy answers have never survived this case for long. So the question remains exactly where it began. What happened to John O'Keefe on Fairview Road? And until that question feels fully answered, this story is not finished. If this case stayed with you, let me know what you think. Do you believe Karen Red is guilty? Or do you believe the truth begins inside that house? Subscribe for more deep-dive true crime cases told with full context, key evidence, and the details that matter. Stay curious, stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next story.